The world that Jesus lived in was a Greek-speaking world. Jesus spoke multiple languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. And literacy wasn't universal. Some historical records place the literacy rate at far less than 10%. Does that matter? Well, when the translators of the authorized version, essentially the King James Version, when they were doing their work, there were no computer databanks, concordances, or lexicons, and the scholars doing the work were humans, so they brought their own baggage to work every day. Can you see where this goes? You're probably way ahead of me on this. I didn't finish this thought until just a few years ago, but I found out that Jesus, the disciples, Paul, the Romans, all of those people didn't speak English. I mean, yes, I know they didn't speak English because they spoke something else, but I didn't think about what it implied, what it really meant. Let me give you an example of the issue with translations. Translations are sometimes suspect. In a conflict between a doctrine and God, if someone speaks in defense of anything other than God, then they're worshiping the wrong thing. If I speak of God in a way that gives him more of something, and you have to defend the doctrine, tradition, verse, or belief at the expense of an expanded God, then I feel I can easily say you're wrong. Let me show you one example of this happening. I have a case where significant changes are made to the truth God shares of himself because one word is mistranslated. Follow me on this. Here is a beautiful passage, Acts 17:31. The context is incredible, almost unbelievable. Look at verses 16 to 34 and think of who is talking and where he's talking. This is Paul, an Israelite standing in the den of Greek intellectual pagan worship. He quotes no Hebrew scriptures as he tells these idol worshippers of the unknown God, the God he knows. He speaks of what God is accomplishing on the earth. Then he says, "For in him we live and move and have our being, for we are his offspring." He quotes a pagan poet and then says, "And the times of ignorance God winked at, but now commandeth all men everywhere to repent, because he hath appointed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness by the man whom he hath ordained, whereof he has given assurance unto all men, and that he hath raised him from the dead." It says God is going to give assurance to all men. Assurance? Of what? Here is where I have heard different things taught. I've heard different conflicting and random things, and really, I'm not going to get into much detail about the error. And yes, I call it error. Why? Mistranslation. Most of the translations say there's a certainty given to men about judgment because of the resurrection of Christ from the dead. But nah, that's not what it says. That is an interpretation based on a faulty translation. If the translation is corrected, then you don't need to interpret the verse. You can just read it. The word assurance is translated by some guy sitting in a large airy room in England. They're going from Greek into English, but primarily using the work of William Tyndale. The word they translated into assurance is a word that, in our modern day, is listed in Strong's Concordance as G4102, pistis. This Greek word is used 244 times in the Greek scriptures, and only one time is it translated as assurance. That's 244 times. That is 244 times, and every time it's translated as a word, and the word means faithfulness, belief, faith. What's my point? Well, picture this. So it's Bethard, who's been given the task of this day translating a portion of the church history and the writings of the Acts of the Apostles. He reads a passage in Greek that cannot be correct. It's inconsistent with all that he's been taught of God's judgment. He's sitting, laboring over the Greek, and reads the fruit of his translation that says, "Because he hath appointed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom he hath ordained, whereof he hath given pistis," faith. unto all men, and that he hath raised him from the dead. Berthod needs help. That can't be right. So he asks for 2 senior translators, and they do what clergy have done for years. They say, "Oh, I know it says faith, but nah, that must mean assurance. Instead of faith, it can't be God giving faith to all men. That goes against our doctrine." 243 times, pistis is translated to mean faith. But imagine the problem if a verse clearly said God would give faith to all men and that he raised Jesus from the dead. See, no interpretation needed. That is what it says. Ever heard the phrase, lost in translation? I overheard this outside of a church, and it's what I never learned in Sunday school.